Dunn, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs from your home in Bristol, right here in the UK. You are a writer, teacher, and lecturer at Bath Spa University. Your new book, Sins of My Father, A Daughter, a Cult, A Wild Unraveling, has just been published, a memoir about growing up with a father who gave up on a loving relationship with his children to follow a guru and the cult built around him. So how are you doing, Lily? I know from previous guests that publishing a book can be a bit of a hectic time. So are you going through the whole book tour whirlwind, or are you just going to sit back and see how it goes?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the show. Yeah, I'm actually feeling quite exhausted. It was quite a big build-up toward publication. It was published on the 17th of March, which was, it's about 3 weeks ago now. And then there's been various things booked in for after that. But yeah, not a huge kind of whirlwind book tour. I think post-COVID, those are not sort of coming into effect quite so much as they used to, which has suited me quite well because I've quite enjoyed doing events from home and being online a bit more. But yeah, it's been a great experience and some wonderful reviews. So just sitting back and kind of waiting to see what comes out and who's picked it up and who's recognized it. Was really happy to have a review from The Guardian here in the UK, which is, I'm sure a lot of your viewers will know, is one of the main UK broadsheets. And all the reviews have been really, really encouraging and really, it was book of the day for The Guardian, and it was book of the week for the Daily Mail as well. So yeah, it's been really great to read that.
Today, we're going to be talking about the events that inspired your book. But before we dive into the world of the Rajneesh cult and how it affected your family, let's just get some background. Lily, your parents met and married when they were still very young. And although your mother was doing well at a London university, your father brought quite a lot of emotional baggage into that relationship.
Yeah, he did. I always was told and kind of had memories of that time, like, when they met, it was quite a nice way. So my mother used to tell me a story of how they met, and she was at London University and studying philosophy and English. And when he met my mum, so my mum and my dad were very young, as you said, and my mum was 18 and my dad was 19, and my mum was at university. My dad had been trying to pass his solicitor exams for some time. His dad was very determined that he should be a solicitor, which didn't really suit my dad's temperament. But he had gone down quite a traditional schooling route. So he had been sent to prep boarding school as a 7-year-old, which, to me now, I just think is so incredibly young. But of course, in those days, the 1950s in the UK, this was quite common practice. And his sister actually remained at home, and went to the local comprehensive. And when I look back at that and spoke to his sister about it, I just find it astounding for this little boy. I sort of a lot of sympathy for him having been sent away at such a young age, and he was quite sensitive and quite artistic. And I think those kinds of schools weren't really set up for that kind of temperament. So I think, his sister, my aunt, believes that his schooling had quite a big emphasis or influence on his personality. We could say that he was traumatized as a child. I think he was sexually abused. He did admit to that to my mother later, and he also admitted to his sister that he was raped as a boy at school. And definitely his behavior as he grew up was kind of erratic and quite disconnected. So you could possibly put it down to that early experience of being evicted from the home. of losing the security of the home and being thrown into, what was often quite a kind of anarchic environment, I think, living with a whole load of little boys without parental care and that sort of consistent love that, so many of us rely on as we're growing up. So my mum and dad had a very different upbringing. My mum was the eldest of a big family. She was the eldest of 8, and they were immigrants from South Africa and came over to the UK when she was 6. And she grew up in a big rambling farmhouse in Wiltshire, a very close family with a very devoted and loving parents, and particularly a father. My dad, I think, was very disconnected from his parents. And when he met my mum, I think he was very seduced by this sort of lovely, warm, rambling family environment. So my parents were very much in love. I would say that my father was, my mum's first love, although she had a relationship with someone before then. But yeah, she was very taken by him. I think he was very passionate, but also quite insecure from quite a young, quite formative time in their relationship. They got married very quickly, so they were married within the year. And they set up this lovely home together first of all in Notting Hill, and then they bought a house in Islington in London, and they set up a publishing company, which was quite successful at the beginning. But my dad very quickly sort of had a roving eye, and was, having affairs, which my mum didn't know about at the time. But I think she sensed, and but my dad would not, if she confronted him, he wouldn't admit to it. So he was already sort of living a bit of a double life, which again, I think his sister, when I've spoken to her about it, has put that down to perhaps to the boarding school experience of sort of having to split yourself between a school where you're unhappy and then having to return home, and two very different lives, and also having to learn quite early on to lie, because you lose your sense of privacy, you lose your sense of your own will in a way, being told and sort of controlled by prefects or by teachers. And so I don't know, it's hard to say whether he definitely, that sort of formed his temperament, or it may be that he was also just, quite narcissistic and sort of lacking in empathy. But anyway, this sort of started this kind of duplicitous life. And then, my brother was born, and then I was born. And by the time I was born, 2 years after my brother, my dad was already sort of quite embedded in having affairs, and he had already threatened to leave my mom. He had met someone who he wanted to be with, but he was not ready at that point to actually leave us. I think he was very guilt-ridden as well. And he was going through various therapies to try and sort of combat this restlessness that he had within the marriage. And I think what was kind of tragic about it was that actually my mom and dad really loved each other, and there was nothing wrong with their relationship, but there was just this sort of innate restlessness in my dad where he couldn't quite commit to the normal conventional life, the responsibilities of being a husband, being monogamous, and having children. So by the time I arrived, a lot of this is sort of me looking back and trying to decipher some of the decisions that my dad made later on in his life, and I interrogate this in my memoir. My dad was having an affair with someone who was quite close to my mom, and so there was always a sense, I think, that my dad was sort of distracted and elsewhere, not fully with us as a parent and as a father.
Well, your father was quite the salesman and entrepreneur, always chasing that first million. Sadly, his addictions and narcissistic behavior showed no signs of abating. Life seemed quite predictable until, when you were age 6, something happened that catapulted your family onto a totally unexpected path. So tell us about that.
Yeah, we just woke up one day and my dad had kind of disappeared on us. He just left. My mom and dad were still married, they were still together, and then one day he just decided to up and leave, and we didn't know where he went, and we didn't know when he was coming back. I was 6 years old, my brother was 8, and to us it sort of felt like he had died. And I don't know whether that was just us trying to kind of, survive, trying to live with this sort of very inexplicable thing. But, we literally did not know where he was. And then I think at some point he did phone, and he told my mum that he had gone to India with a woman that he had met in a peep show in Soho. And she had introduced him to her guru, who was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. This was 1979, and Bhagwan was sort of at the height, I suppose, or at the beginning of the height of his popularity. There were lots and lots of Europeans, Americans, Westerners, I suppose, who were flooding over to Pune in India to take sannyas, which was basically, to be given a new name by Bhagwan and a new identity. And my dad, sort of decided that this was what he wanted to do. And I guess, looking back and trying to understand it, he was unhappy. He was restless, as I said. His business was doing well, but he also was not particularly reliable with money, and, he had debts. But, this was a business that he'd built up with my mom, and also, other family members. My mom's sister worked for them as well. And, we had a home, we had a mortgage, and he just left. He was gone for 6 months. My mom had to take the business into bankruptcy, had to explain to all their writers and illustrators, that there was no money coming in for them. She had to give up some of our assets. He had signed our house against a loan, which we would have lost if it hadn't have been for my mom's dad, who came in and paid off the loan so that we could keep our house. So, he put us in a lot of danger for quite a reckless thing for him. So, he phoned reverse charges from India, told my mom that, he was in India and he'd taken sannyas and he'd joined this religious cult, this ashram. And my mom sort of very quietly said, but what about the children? You haven't considered the children. And he said something along the lines of, oh yeah, because I was really, really unhappy. I felt the abandonment very acutely. It felt to me that he had left, he had abandoned us. It was like a lover had sort of walked out. I felt like it was my fault. I didn't understand why he was suddenly there and then suddenly gone, why he had been there and then he was suddenly gone. And my mom said, Lily is particularly upset about this. And he said to her, it is her choice. If she wants to feel happy or sad, it is up to her. My mom says that luckily the interference in the line from India, sort of the phone line started to crackle. So she didn't have to hear any more of his nonsense. But I think this was the first introduction to her, certainly, just of the kind of the level of, I wouldn't say brainwashing at that point, but just this level of lack of responsibility, which was definitely promoted by the sannyasin cult. And I think that really appealed to my dad, and it appealed to his temperament. He could go over there and he could behave in whatever way he wanted to. He could take many lovers. He could, be promiscuous. He could do whatever he liked. And it didn't matter, because that was all part of the religious premise, was that you behaved irresponsibly. You were only responsible for yourself. If anyone felt unhappy, it was their responsibility to deal with that. Of course, as adults, you have a choice, don't you? You're much more in control of your emotions. But to say that to a child who is mourning their father who has disappeared is just insane. But he returned after 6 months, and he was dressed in the colors of the sunset, and he had a mala around his neck, a beaded necklace with a picture of his guru, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, in the center of his necklace, in this little glass disc. And my brother and I met him on Hampstead High Street, and his girlfriend was in the car, and he said to us that he had been reborn. And me and my brother looked at each other, sort of slightly bemused and perplexed, thinking, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you're no longer our father? And my dad said, my name is Purvadaya, the man that you knew before is no longer. And we were a bit like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? Thanks, Dad. So yeah, it was quite a moment.
It's very typical of a cult in that he started using cult speak, like when he said you can choose to be happy, and B, he changes his identity.
Yes.
So that's something I've heard before. So
yeah, very convenient.
Well, before we dive in any deeper, let's just get an overview of the Rajneesh cult. Lily, for anyone who doesn't know, what was this group all about, and what were their beliefs?
Well, I think it's very much embedded in the time. At the time, when it was thriving, I think Bhagwan kind of hit on a zeitgeist, I suppose, in a way. I mean, like any cult, it started with just a lone man, an Indian man, with a lovely long beard, and who was very sort of irreverent and attractive. He had beautiful welling eyes, as I describe them in the book. He was intelligent, and I think this was in the 60s that he had a small gathering, locals, Indians, and then word got out, and more sort of Europeans came to visit him and listen to his teachings. He was clever in that he drew together Eastern philosophies with what was going on, what was developing in the West at that time, which was psychoanalysis and philosophy. And, so it was quite a nice sort of mishmash of different influences. And, the East was becoming more and more beguiling to the West. And it was mysterious, but it was also, the West was looking to the East for inspiration. You had the Beatles had their own Maharishi, they had their own guru. There were, I guess, more people were traveling across the seas. They were exploring these countries. But also, I think at that time, the sort of late 60s, or it was obviously post-sexual revolution, post or around the time sexual revolution, and also experimentation with LSD. There was a sense of something other, that we wanted more than just what we had been given by our parents' generation, who, of course, I'm not saying me, this is my father, his parents' generation, who were post-war. It was all about sort of domestic commercialization, in terms of sort of buying a really nice washing machine, having a comfortable home, feeling very kind of grateful for what you had. But I imagine that to my father's generation, this could be quite mundane, the sort of suburban thick carpets and net curtains. So yeah, it was definitely, it came out of a restlessness, I guess, in culture, certain particular people at that time who were looking outwards perhaps and looking for some kind of alternative life. So yeah, so it just grew like a lot of these religions did. Bhagwan went to university, studied philosophy. He was very clever, as I said, but also I think he was, I realized recently that he was sort of practicing hypnotism from quite a young age as well. And that became quite a big part of the movement. I mean, it was very much based on meditation, but what he called active meditation, which was a kind of vibration, you're sort of jumping up and down and dancing and hooing and hollering and almost hyperventilating. So disciples would get into quite a kind of heightened state and feel quite high when they were in the ashram or in certain meditation practices. And then he would give these what he called darshans, which were his rhetoric. He would sit and talk about his view of the world and give advice, and people just simply fell in love with him. And I think he obviously had a lot of charisma. And, my father said that when he was in his presence, he felt physically, he sort of felt a vibration going through his body. He felt this physical aura, this physical presence. And I've heard other people say that about him as well. So, I can absolutely understand in those early days how it was so attractive. And I mean, I never went to Pune, but I've seen videos of what it was like in those early days. And, and I think it was very appealing. There were lots of intelligent, educated, interesting people, often from kind of quite creative backgrounds, just hanging out and having a really nice time together and working for the community, creating things. There was a big emphasis on art and therapy, meditation, music, and obviously a beautiful place, very rich and lush and lovely gardens, and it was hot and exotic, and then it got too big for the ashram in Pune, and so they started looking for a bigger place, a bigger outlet, or space for them all to be in. And that's when this woman Sheila got involved, who was his secretary at the time, and she was sent out to America. The other thing that was happening was that as Bhagwan was getting more and more popular, his books, his lectures would be translated into books and then published. And there was kind of a bit of a kind of marketing campaign around him, and his lectures and his sayings were being circulated. People were leaning on him and learning from him, not just in his presence. He started to become a bit of a celebrity, and I guess America had kind of felt like a rational place for them to go. So Sheila went to Oregon and found this big kind of ranch. It was big wild country, which this was all covered in a documentary that was on Netflix recently called Wild Wild Country.
Yeah.
Which was very well done actually, and it kind of brought the cult to the mainstream. I mean, I remember in my childhood in North London there were lots of sannyasins around. I mean, obviously I was part of it with my dad, and my dad was living a little bit in Hampstead for a bit, and he was going to and fro the communes in the early days, but he also lived in a place called Medina, which was a commune in Suffolk. But I remember just seeing sannyasins around, these people dressed in the colours of the sunset with their malas, and that was North London. And I think in lots of cities around Europe, it was quite a common thing in the kind of late 70s, early 80s to see these characters. But when it moved to America, it just got much bigger because they had this big space, and they built a city and they called it Rajneeshpuram. And and it's incredible actually watching Wild Wild Country. It was hugely educational for me just to see quite what they managed. They built the infrastructure for a city. They put in electricity, water. They built these houses and massive meditation centers. And one thing I reflect on in my book is I think, this is my opinion, it may not be correct, but Bhagwan went into silence quite soon after he moved to Oregon. And I wondered, whether it was just too big for him. It had been quite self-contained and much more emphasis on meditation when it was at the ashram in Pune. But then suddenly it kind of got taken over by Sheila, and it became something much bigger. And it was much more about work rather than meditation. So people could only stay in Oregon if they were working. And they worked hard for the community. So things kind of shifted, I think, when they moved to America. And if you watch Wild Wild Country, you'll see that then also the political situation became much more fraught, because they actually took the wild country, the ranch, under false pretenses. It was supposed to be used as farmland, and they obviously had no intention of using it as farmland. And so there were lots of legal issues around that. They had taken it illegally, and the local people of Oregon were not happy to have them there, and the Rajneesh people were not good neighbors to the local Antilopian people who lived in Antelope, which was the local town. And they started to sort of force them out of the town, and they took over the town, and the mood of the place became a lot more power hungry than it had been before. And then it all turned pretty nasty with the FBI kind of getting involved, and really, really quite intense. And Osho in the end got arrested and deported and not allowed back in America.
And Osho was his name once he moved to America. He changed it to Osho.
I think he changed it after the whole political thing kind of came out, when because they also got done. He got done for immigration fraud, so they were also doing this illegal, getting people to marry each other in order to become residents in America. And there was also drug smuggling. There was all sorts of stuff going on. So I think he changed his name once the kind of, the kind of the political temperature started to rise. And or it may have, I'm not absolutely sure, but or it may have been later after he had been arrested, when he kind of wanted to take on a slightly different identity, or separate himself from that influence, because he and Sheila split quite dramatically. She ended up in prison for some time.
And wouldn't you say, Lily, that the reason that these sort of religions appeal to Westerners is because perhaps they looked at it and thought, wow, it's basically derived from Hinduism, which supposedly has been around for 5,000 years, longer than any other religion, perhaps. And they thought that, maybe they've got something there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also, so much of it is about the charisma of the guru, isn't it? And actually believing in enlightenment, believing that if you behave in a certain way, you're going to be enlightened, and that is the ultimate way to be. I mean, my father certainly believed that. And the extraordinary thing, I mean, I don't know, did he believe that? I mean, he definitely kind of played that card. But the extraordinary thing I found was that my dad was a particular temperament, and I think a lot of people who were drawn to that religion were a particular temperament, and I would say that they were possibly quite narcissistic. I'm not saying everybody, but my dad was certainly narcissistic, and if we were in a time of labeling people then, which of course we weren't, but looking back I can see that. But it fed into his sort of grandiose sense of himself, into his entitlement, which again might have come from his boarding school background. My dad was a narcissist. He was a narcissistic temperament, and he was also entitled. And I don't know if that came from his boarding school experience, or it was just a patriarchal thing of that time, the 1970s, white male. But there was definitely a sense in that cult that it encouraged that sort of self-serving behavior, in that you could do what you wanted, and with no consequences for other people's feelings. You didn't have to be responsible for other people. You could take what you wanted. And I think that was really, really encouraged by the religion. It was also not a safe place for children, because children were seen as an obstruction to their parents' spiritual development. And I was lucky that I didn't live with my father. I only visited him. He didn't live on the ranch, by the way. He visited, but he set up a commune of his own in Italy. So I spent my summers with him, but I lived with my mother in London, and I never became a sannyasin. But I definitely experienced the fallout of that sort of neglect of a child, in that children were not protected. It was convenient for parents to see them as little adults in a way, because they didn't want to take on the responsibility of caring for the child. So whenever me and my brother went to spend our summers with him, we were left to our own devices. We were free. We were on and off our scooters, flying around the winding roads in and out of Florence, sort of having a great time, but it was pretty reckless. And nobody kind of cared or considered where we were or what we were doing. But I think the kids who grew up in the communes, had that permanently, really, although they also had lots of great experiences, because there's a lot of fun that comes with that, and also this sense of growing up quite young and being responsible for yourself, because no one else is going to care for you. So yeah, there was a pretense Bhagwan said to his disciples that the commune would be a better place for the children. It would be a better family for the children than the parents could be, because parents bring all their baggage of their past and, sort of the trauma of their own sort of family backgrounds to parenting. So the communes would be a healthier place for children. And I'm not sure that was totally correct.
Just thinking very quickly about the guru himself, Rajneesh. If you ask somebody to draw their image of a wise guru, they'd probably come up with a drawing that looked pretty much like Osho, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, he was incredibly, yeah. He
The
does.
beard and the eyes and
He plays the
everything.
part for sure. And then when he was in America, he became quite kind of glitzy, and because also he had these very wealthy people. He chose quite wealthy people to be close to him. So people would bring him money and they'd bring him Rolls Royces. I mean, he became known. People might remember him as the guru who had 96 Rolls Royces, which is extraordinary. And he had like really, really expensive gold Rolex watches, or even more expensive than Rolex. But, he loved a bit of glitz and a bit of diamonds. I kind of, in my book, I write about it as his sort of dynasty days, when he was wearing gold trimmed capes and, all sorts of very over the top outfits.
It was in 1985 that the Rajneesh cult finally imploded. Many in the cult lost money in pyramid schemes and such alike. And your dad, always chasing that first million, found himself at the wrong end of an email scam. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't make it up, really. It's quite extraordinary what happened. So yeah, I mean, the one part of it is that the ranch, or Rajneeshpuram, Oregon, it all imploded. Osho was chased out of the country, ended up being sued a lot of money, and ended up going back to India and changing his name. I'm pretty sure that's when he changed his name. And kind of trying to disassociate himself from everything that had gone slightly poisonous. My dad was living in Italy at the time. We heard about all this through the grapevine, really, just through people reporting back and gossip around the living room table. My father carried on living in Italy. He lived in a commune, as I said, and it was also a publishing business that he ran. So people would live and work with him. And it was a thriving business, and he was developing his business and doing quite well. They published some books for that were sannyasin related, but then other things that were not directly related to the sannyasins, the cult, but sort of along the same lines. Like he published a book called Wonder Child, which published and wrote a book called Wonder Child, which I always thought was extraordinary. It was about enlightened parenting. So my dad thought he was fully to write a book about enlightened parenting, which I've got on my bookshelf, and it's just awful. He's sort of parodying his guru's sort of slightly wishy-washy, kind of unfocused ideas about kids and the best way of raising them, which I find quite sort of sickening to return to these days. But so yeah, he was doing all right, and then he had remarried. He married a very young woman who was 18 when they met, and my father was in his late 30s. I was 10 when they met, so this is previous to them moving to Italy. They moved to Italy together, which is sort of extraordinary. She was so young, but they were very happily married for some time. They stayed together for a long time, and then they came back to England, to London for a bit, carried on working, and their business was thriving. They lived in Hampstead. He always lived in really lovely addresses, always was quite good at spending money. And then they moved to America. So they got a green card, both of them, to work in America. And they moved to California, to Mill Valley and Marin County, a very smart part of California. And that's really when his business started to really thrive, and they were happy times. I think they were doing well. They had a nice community of quite kind of hippie people, still sannyasins, but not so much. He was sort of more on the periphery. And I was sort of in my early 20s, and I'd go and see him. And then he and his wife kind of, yeah, they sort of drifted apart a bit, and they moved to a little town called Bolinas on the seaside. It was just north of San Francisco. And my dad and his wife bought a house there, and it was right next door to a bar. And my dad really loved it there, but my stepmom didn't like it so much. It was quite kind of kooky, and it was sort of where rich city people had their holiday homes, but also appealed to kind of down and outs as well, people who had opted out of society and lived in their cars. There was quite a lot of kind of drink and drugs, and it was a kind of kooky, a bit of an edgy place. And so my stepmom moved to New York to try kind of on a trial separation. And I was living in London, and I was about to get married. I'd got engaged to be married. And then my dad told me and my brother that he was coming to London, and he was going to be staying in the Connaught Hotel, which is this incredibly smart hotel in
very
London.
posh.
Very posh. It's kind of, very traditional, probably one of the most expensive hotels in London.
Oh, yeah.
And he told us that his bill was being paid for by these Russians. And the reason that they were paying for his bill was because they had tracked him down as the next of kin to a distant, long-lost relative, cousin, who he never knew, but who had a terrible, tragic car accident and had died. And this had come to my dad in an email. And, it was a typical scam. I mean, it was like, it couldn't get more scam than a scam. So we've all had those emails arrive in our inbox.
The Nigerian prince, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But for some reason, my dad had fallen for it. And I didn't understand it. But kind of looking back, I realized, he was, he was deluded. He was also drinking a lot then, which we weren't aware of, and it kind of crept up on him. He was never a drinker. He obviously was an addictive personality. He'd been a philanderer. He was always chasing the next buck, the next bit of money. He was a workaholic. And, looking back, I can see that it was quite a natural progression for him to turn to alcohol. He was also having trouble sleeping. He was missing his wife. He was very sad she had left. He got addicted to sleeping pills, but he was also drinking. And I think so he fell for this scam, came to the Connaught. I went to see him after maybe day 2 of him being there, and he had not left his room. He had this enormous suite. It was like a bedroom with a living room and a walk-in wardrobe, and like the biggest suite you could ever imagine. And it was just on Hyde Park. And I went and saw him, and he was drinking, and he had like cans of Coke and rum on the bar. It had its own bar. And I just said, Dad, we need to go out. I need to get you out. Let's go for a walk. And he was like, no, the Russians are coming. I've got to wait for the Russians. And I was like, no, come on, this is crazy. Come on, let's go for a walk. So I took him out for a walk around Hyde Park, but he was really not well. He was very distracted. And we went back to the hotel, and he ended up taking some money out of a safe. And so the Russians turned up when I was there, and he took some money out of a safe. I was like, Dad, what are you doing? And he said, I need to give them money in order to get the money that it is my right. This money that's been left to me.
About 50K, wasn't it?
Yeah, he gave them £50,000, and for the promise of about, I don't know, $2 million or something. He gave them $50,000 for the promise of $2 million. And I was there when it happened, and yeah, I mean, it was just such a sort of shocking thing, and I felt terrible that I didn't intervene more, but I was so shocked by it all. I just couldn't quite understand how this was happening. And of course, these Russians were not paying for his hotel suite, and he was there for almost a week, I think, in the end. So he would have had to have footed that bill as well. But that really was the beginning of his downfall. I think when he realized that he had been scammed, it must have been such a huge shock to him that he just sort of buried himself back in his little house in Bolinas, and he took a big dive into alcoholism at that point.
Well, losing a parent to a cult hasn't been easy on you, to say the least, but it's definitely taught you a few things. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so it all kind of ended quite tragically in that my dad died of alcoholism age 61. And, really, I kind of look back now and I think it was this sort of protracted suicide. I think he didn't want to live, and I think he didn't want to live the ordinary life. And when he realized that he was losing his money, he was losing his home, he was deported back to the UK and became a derelict on the street. He became he lost everything, which was terrible for us. It was such a shock because we kind of didn't really see it coming. And also, we lost him. But I think he wasn't prepared to accept an ordinary life. I always wanted him to be my dad and to get a little house and have a garden, and I could go and visit him and we could just hang out and have a normal time together. But he never wanted that. He always wanted something else, something bigger. And I think in the end, that was his downfall. So for me, I couldn't quite shake this off, or the trauma of what had happened, and also just this sort of lack of understanding, I suppose, of how someone who on the face of it had lived such a kind of adventurous life on his own terms, he had had so much money and so much success, this beautiful young wife, could just, for it all to have gone so terribly wrong. And I didn't know if that was the addictive gene, if it was that he lost his way somehow. I don't know. Was it the cult? Was it the alcohol? I didn't know. And I think my quest to kind of try and work that out was me writing the book. But before that, I volunteered to teach creative writing to a group of recovering addicts through St Mungo's in London. Just to try and sort of, I suppose, just to kind of immerse myself in that world a little bit and understand addiction a bit better, but also to give back something to that community, because I'd felt so hopeless and helpless with my dad. And that was a big learning curve for me, because I learned how to teach creative writing, but also I, was with this group of people who really thrived under my tuition, and together we created, I got Arts Council funding and did it over a long period of time. And we created a book, of recovery stories. And that was sort of the beginning of my healing in a way. I also did a PhD at Birkbeck. And that's what my book, Sins of My Father, which is here, this is the book that I've written about my dad. It really came out of the PhD. And part of the PhD was research. I was researching cults, I was researching addiction, but it kind of came out of a need more in me, just to try and understand, rather than, me sort of sitting down and thinking, okay, I'm doing a PhD, I need to do lots of reading and research. I just felt quite compelled to try and to kind of elevate myself, and I was trying to stand apart from the experience so that it didn't dictate my life. It wasn't under my skin anymore. I could understand it from, be apart from it. And I think writing really enables you to do that. I also went through extensive therapy, because my marriage broke down, which I think was very connected to kind of unprocessed grief over my father and just the hold that he had over me. And this extraordinary life that I'd sort of, dipped in and out of. So yeah, there were lots of things that sort of came together. But I definitely, through that process, I found a place of healing, and I moved from London and relocated in Bristol. I met a new man, and and I've got children, and we have a lovely life all together now. And the book, was written, and I think that sort of enabled me to, create something and be in control of a narrative that I had felt very out of control of. So in the end, yeah, it was good.
Your book, Sins of My Father, A Daughter, a Cult, a Wild Unraveling, has just been published. Already, it's garnering fantastic reviews. So what have people been saying about this memoir, and what do you hope this work will bring to the world of not only cult survivors, but broken families as well?
I've had lots and lots of amazing feedback so far. It's only been out in the
Mm.
world for 3 weeks, but I've got so many people who've been writing to me, apart from the more kind of national reviews. And I think it speaks for a cohort of people of my generation, born into the 70s, who are now coming into their lives. They're becoming parents themselves. They're entering middle age, and they're looking back and reflecting on their past. So what I've done, which was important to me, was give my experience a voice. And I think when we have parents who are destructive or self-serving, and who abandon us as well, we can be quite stuck in that kind of place of needing to be heard or not quite knowing ourselves, not quite, particularly when there's a cult involved, because the cult kind of whitewashes out your personality, and it puts an imprint on you. And so, if I had that from my dad, sort of blaming me for the feelings that I had, which was a silencing really of me, and a silencing of the things that I found difficult growing up. So I think, writing it has been empowering in that way. And I've definitely had feedback from people saying, this is my experience, and you've given it a voice, and thank you. And they're grateful to me for having stood up and spoken my truth. And I think that enables other people, other survivors, to feel that they too could speak their voice, speak their truth, have a voice. And of course, by having a voice, it becomes a generous act, because you are inviting other people into your experience, and saying you can do this too. So I think in that way, it's been really good. I spend a lot of time on the craft of it. It's not just a scandalous kind of content-led memoir, full of abuse and neglect and trauma. I really wanted to create something beautiful out of a really difficult situation, and I think I've achieved that. And it's something I'm very proud of. And I think that also is part of healing, is that you have generated something out of a really, something that was very dark at times, and very, very traumatic. So yeah, I feel very proud of that. And I think that can be applied to any kind of art. It's not just writing. It can be your painting, or your, making things, or whatever it is. I think I really do believe in the healing quality of the creative arts.
And I was thinking, Lily, also that there's not that many books on cults that I've seen, or I've read anyway, which are from the perspective of a family member looking at somebody who's been drawn into a cult. They're usually about somebody who was in a cult and got out of it themselves. So it's perhaps it's unique.
Yeah, I think so. And it does seem that people are really interested in that aspect of it, in the sort of being straddling the two worlds, being both in the conventional life, well, as much as it was conventional living in Islington in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But, it was conventional, and I went to school, and I had a secure mom, and who loved me and my brother. And then sort of stepping into this extraordinary life, this sort of fantasy life. In a way, it wasn't based in any kind of reality. And I think that is really interesting, because it's also quite a confusing place for the person who's in it, like me. It wasn't a particularly settling kind of way to be. But yeah, so that has been really nice, because I always felt the outsider. There's a picture of me on the front cover here, where I'm dressed in the colors of the sunset. Even though I wasn't a sannyasin, I
Oh,
was
yes.
determined to wear the clothes that all the other kids were wearing,
That
and I
was
wanted
at Medina, wasn't it?
Medina, yeah, and I wanted to belong. And it's really nice for me now to have people interested in the fact that I didn't belong, that I was looking in from the outside, and that's quite an interesting perspective.
Well, it's been a very emotional journey for you, Lily, and I want to commend you for pouring your heart out into this very important memoir. I will leave links to your social media and to Sins of My Father, of course, in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you. Lovely to talk to you. Pune, the Indian sun was warm and rich with light. Sannyasins, Bhagwan's disciples, lived in wooden huts and abandoned Raj apartments, dotted around the enchanted Corrigan Park, sleeping beneath high ceilings and clattering fans. They wore lungis, home-dyed in colours of the first rays of the rising sun, maroon, orange and pink, traditional Hindu holy dress but without asceticism. Bhagwan's followers slung their malas around their necks and under an arm while they danced or made love. They worked as a community, cooking, cleaning, making crafts, running therapy groups, while their red-ragged children played in the dust and dirt. But mostly they meditated. They faced their fears together, beneath sweeping canvas canopies, their shoulders rocking and arms stretched up to heaven, to the rhythm of live drums and a backdrop of palms, heat haze and bougainvillea. They breathed, they danced, they hollered. They then collapsed on the ground, still with silence, forming pink stars with their spent bodies. Bhagwan was seductive with his long, soft beard and flowing robes. He was beautiful too, with a smooth concha head and mesmeric welling eyes. He was provocative and irreverent. In those early days he dressed humbly in white. "The mystic is a dropout," he pronounced in one of his discourses. "The real revolutionary is not fighting anybody. He simply sees the absurdity of things and he drops out." Like the first hippies of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco in the 1960s, Bhagwan believed change was only possible from inaction, a soulful step away from the system. This was as seductive as nectar to the swarms of Westerners looking for relief from the mundanity of their lives, the dullness of the cities where they lived, in jobs they found tedious, the ties of bills and mortgages, the captivity of parenthood. Bhagwan's central philosophy, that you can only be responsible for yourself, was my father's sweet honey.